everybody, how are you? Have you had a good week? I hope so. Maybe some of you are getting ready to go back to school next week. I'm sure your teachers have been looking forward to seeing you, and I'm sure you'll really love to see your friends, even if you're maybe a little bit nervous right now about going back to school. It's been such a long time. Jesus had a special group of friends as well. They were called his disciples, and they stayed with him all the time. And he taught them about heaven and about God and about what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. Today's story tells us about how he asked one of those disciples to come and follow him. Jesus was walking out by a lake, and lots of people had come to see him, so he started to teach them. As Jesus taught the people, he saw a man. This man's name was Levi, and he was a tax collector. That meant that he worked for the government, for the rulers, and he gathered up money for them. But a lot of the people didn't like tax collectors because they weren't very honest. They gathered up the money for the government, but then they kept some for themselves. Now that wasn't the right thing to do. Lots of people didn't like them for it. People didn't like tax collectors. Nobody wanted to be friends with them because they didn't tell the truth and they kept money for themselves that didn't belong to them. But Jesus knew that Levi was one of the people that he wanted to be friends with. And he said, "Come along with me." Now Levi stopped what he was doing. He walked away from his work and he followed Jesus. He didn't say, can I come tomorrow? I'm a bit busy. And he didn't say, I'm not quite ready. And he didn't say, just 5 more minutes. He just stopped what he was doing and followed Jesus. Levi was so excited to have been asked to be one of Jesus' special friends that he threw a party, a big dinner for Jesus and his disciples. And he invited some of his own friends as well, people who were maybe tax collectors as well and maybe weren't very well liked, who wouldn't have gone to too many parties. Jesus was sitting and talking to them, and he told lots of the tax collectors about the kingdom of God, and many of them became his friends that day. They wanted to be followers of Jesus as well. As they were all eating and talking, some of the teachers from the temple, the teachers of the law, came along and they watched them and they grumbled and they said, "Who does Jesus think he is? Does he not know who these people are? These are not nice people. What kind of an example is this, being friends with these people that no one likes?" Jesus heard this and he said to them, "Who needs a doctor, the healthy or the sick? I have come to save those who are sinners, not those people who think they are so very good." Jesus came for all of us. God has chosen us to be his people, and he has plans for all of our lives. The only choice that we have to make is whether to follow him or not. God is not going to force us to do anything we don't want to do. But when you consider all that God has to give us, why wouldn't you choose to be a friend of Jesus? Our next story today is read by a very special lady. Her name is Sandi, and here's her story.
Hello, I'm going to read a story to you today about some birds singing in a lovely tree just outside a window, very similar to the one you can see through my window there. And it's a story about a man called Mr. Hobhouse who's moving into his new home. What an exciting day Sunday was for Mr. Hobhouse. He hired a big red truck and moved everything he owned into a 2-storied house where his bedroom upstairs looked out onto a most wonderful tree. Mr. and Mrs. Quinn, his new next-door neighbours, watched through their kitchen window as he carried a fish tank up the front path and through the door. Mr. Patch, who lived on the other side, watched through a crack in the fence as Mr. Hobhouse pushed a trolley loaded with books. By tea time, Mr. Hobhouse had moved everything, pots and pans, his CD player, his bed and favourite chair, his cups and saucers, and nothing had been broken. Nothing, that is to say, except his alarm clock. Mr. Hobhouse made himself a cup of tea and sat in the kitchen looking around him. He was very proud of his new home. But how am I going to wake up in time to go to work? He asked himself. I'm such a sound sleeper. By the end of the day, he was very tired indeed. He got ready for bed, took a last look at the splendid tree outside the bedroom window. He said good night to his pet fish, jumped between the sheets, and before he could count 1, 2, 3, was snoring so very, very loudly. In the morning, at 6:15, just when Mr. Hobhouse was used to hearing his alarm clock, he had a most pleasant surprise, for a chorus of birds in the tree outside woke him up from his sleep. He rubbed his eyes, sat up and looked out the window. He saw dozens of birds of all kinds and colours sitting in the branches singing the loveliest songs he'd ever heard. It was just as if they'd especially flown in to serenade him. How marvellous, he said to himself. So much nicer to wake up to than the cranky old alarm clock. And he made himself breakfast and got ready for work, all the time whistling like a bird himself. Every morning the same thing happened. Tuesday came, then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday and Saturday. And each day at 6:15 sharp, the birds would fill the branches of the tree, warbling and trilling, singing and carolling, so that Mr. Hobhouse went to work feeling on top of the world. On Saturday night, when he got into bed, he smiled to himself and he said, how good it is not to have to go to work on Sundays. Mr. Hobhouse enjoyed a lot of things: drinking cups of tea, feeding his fish, reading his books, but more than anything else, he enjoyed staying in bed late on Sunday mornings when he didn't have to go to work. Even if he wasn't actually asleep, he enjoyed lying there, wiggling his toes way down into the bottom of the bed and beating his pillow into different shapes. And at 6:15 the next morning, he was still sound asleep when the chorus of birds struck up outside his window. At first he thought it was Monday and was about to get out of his pyjamas when he suddenly realised what had happened. The birds don't know it's Sunday, he exclaimed. And with one slipper on and one slipper off, he raced downstairs and out to the tree. Don't you know it's Sunday? He cried, shaking the tree furiously until the last of the birds had flown off. Come back tomorrow, he called after them, and stumbled angrily back into the house and upstairs to bed. But on Monday morning, when he woke and looked at his watch, it was 9:30. Good heavens, he cried, I've slept in. I'm going to be late for work and Mr. Merton will be so annoyed. And when he did get to work, he was nearly 2 hours late and very red in the face. I've broken my alarm clock, he explained to Mr. Merton. Well, said the stern Mr. Merton, you just better get yourself a new one right away. And he said it as though he didn't really believe that Mr. Hobhouse anyway. At lunchtime, Mr. Hobhouse went up the street and bought himself a new alarm clock. Couldn't run the risk of being late for work again. The birds mightn't ever come back, he moaned. I've been very bad-tempered and given them a dreadful fright. Next morning, Tuesday morning, at 6:15, the fish nearly leaped out of the tank, and Mr. Hobhouse himself jumped high in the air when the alarm went off. It took him a few seconds to recognise what the noise was and to stop the alarm from ringing. He looked out of the window. Not a bird in sight. Mr. Hobhouse went off to work feeling very sad. He'd frightened his friends, the birds, away, and though the noise of the alarm clock made sure that he woke up and got to work on time, he no longer started out with a head full of cheerful song to carry him through the day. At lunchtime, he shut himself in his office and did some thinking. How can I let the birds see that I'm sorry for what I've done? I love their music, and if only they would come back, they would be quite safe. Then he had a bright idea. On the way home, he bought a lovely apple cake and left it out on the table under the tree. Perhaps the birds would come back, see the cake, and understand they might have a great party. The next morning, Wednesday morning, to Mr. Hobhouse's disappointment, the ugly alarm clock woke him up with its ugly noise. There were no birds, and the apple cake was still where he'd left it. He decided to ask Mr. and Mrs. Quinn for advice and called them to the fence. "Oh, no, not an apple cake, Mr. Hobhouse," said Mrs. Quinn. I'd try a nice jam tart." "Very sweet," agreed Mr. Quinn, licking his lips. And that night he brought home a jam tart and left it on the garden table. On Thursday morning, when the alarm went off, there were still no birds in the tree, and the jam tart was still on the table. He called Mr. Patch to the fence. Mr. Patch stood with his thumbs under his braces and thought. "Oh no, not a jam tart, Mr. Hobhouse. I'd try a ginger pudding topped with maple syrup." That night, Mr. Hobhouse left a ginger pudding on the garden table, but on Friday morning, when the alarm went off, there were still no birds in the tree, and the ginger pudding had not been touched. "I'll have to give them something special," muttered Mr. Hobhouse, "something that they will know is their very own." And on Friday night he went into his kitchen, rolled up his sleeves, took flour, butter, eggs, sugar, and set to work. The cake mixer buzzed, and when the mixture was ready, Mr. Hobhouse poured it into a large cake tin and baked it in the oven. The kitchen was filled with a delicious smell. When it had cooled, he spread the top with chocolate icing, piped cream around the edge in a fancy way, and decorated the top with a message. "Welcome home, birdies," written in peppermint. He carried it out to the table and left it there. "If this doesn't do the trick, I give up," he said to himself sadly. But no, on Saturday morning when the alarm went off, the cake was still there. "That's the finish," said Mr. Hobhouse. "I can do no more. The birds have been frightened away forever, and I'll have to find something else to think about." When he came home on Saturday, he was carrying a rake, a spade, a fork, and a hoe. "I'll make a flower garden," he said, and started digging straight away. What good soil it was! Soft and brown, and moist and full of wiggling worms. Mr. Hobhouse took an old jam tin from the shed and filled it with the longest, fattest worms that he could find. "The fish will love these," he said. "I'll leave the tin here on the table while I put the tools away." But now it was growing dark. He went upstairs, said good night to his two very sleepy fish. But on Sunday morning, a most amazing thing happened. At 6:15, there was a burst of song. Once again, the tree outside his bedroom window was thick with birds, singing even lovelier songs than before. Mr. Hobhouse sat upright in bed and looked out. At first he couldn't understand, and then he noticed that the tin he had accidentally left on the table was almost empty. The birds were eating all the worms. What a picnic they were having! "I'm going to have a picnic too," cried Mr. Hobhouse, struggling into his dressing gown. He made a great pot of tea and brought his cake out into the garden. "Mr. and Mrs. Quinn! Mr. Patch! "Come into my garden and have a cup of tea," he called out excitedly, and in less than a minute they were all sitting under the tree in the garden, drinking tea and eating cake, with the music of the birds ringing in their ears. Well done, Mr. Hobhouse. He got his birds back.